Hey everyone, I'm Sue and welcome back for another episode of Does This Notion Really Work? And in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the ideal seam gauge and guides. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe and that way you don't miss another video. Today we're talking about the ideal seam gauge and guides. They were designed by Luann and Steve Tippett of So Very Smooth. I first discovered these this summer of 2017, while Heidi, my little girl, and I went to the American Sewing Guild conference that was in Orlando, Florida. While there, I had a chance to catch up with some old friends, and while I was doing that, next thing I know, Heidi's down the aisle saying hi to everybody, telling them who I am and what she's doing, and she ended up drawing pictures of all these different designers and Notion inventors, and that's when she met Steve, one of the owners of So Very Smooth. The ideal seam gauge and guides were invented in 2012, and let me tell you something, this is a family business. Everybody involved in the family is involved in the business in some way or another. They have 7 children, and then all of their families have a hand in it as well. I surely encourage you to go check out their website at soverysmooth.com and read the About Us page. It's really cool. One of the most important things that I, as a garment maker and past costume designer and pattern maker, has always been seam allowance. Truly, whether you're making garments or quilts or purses or any kind of little accessory, the first question that you're going to want to know is, what's the seam allowance? Well, these items are going to help you keep a nice straight and very smooth seam, and your seam allowance will be perfect no matter what it is, whether it's 1/8 of an inch all the way up to 1 inch. All right, so are you ready? Let's go ahead and take a closer look at the ideal seam gauge and guides.
Okay, first let's take a look at just the ideal seam gauge. It measures 4 inches wide by 1.5 inches tall. There are 8 different holes which allow you to sink your needle through the desired seam width. The measurements range from 1/8 of an inch to 1 inch and include the scant 1/4 of an inch. Now let's talk about the ideal seam guides. You'll notice that there's 2, but we're going to talk about the straight one first. It measures 4 inches wide by 1.5 inches tall, and it has angles on each short edge, which we're going to talk about what they do a little bit later. The curved guide measures 4 3/8 inch wide by 1.5 inch tall, and it features a cutout on one short edge and a curve on the other. On the wrong side of both of the guides is a thin piece of acetate plastic covering their trademarked So Tacky technology. Let's go ahead and learn how to use the ideal seam gauge. First, you're going to decide which seam allowance you want. And today we're going to use the 1/2 inch seam allowance, which is something that I personally use for a lot of projects. You're going to sink the needle through the 1/2 inch or whichever hole you decide. Now rotate the ideal seam gauge until it is straight with your presser foot. The next thing you're going to do is turn the ideal seam guide to the wrong side, remove the clear plastic film which is protecting the So Tacky technology, and I like to keep that plastic cover for later. Next thing you're going to do is take the straight edge and align it with the ideal seam gauge and get it nice and straight and push it down to secure it to the bed of your machine. And go ahead and raise your needle and remove the ideal seam gauge. And then you're going to just add your fabric underneath the presser foot and keep it lined up with the edge of that ideal seam guide, and it will be a nice smooth seam. You're going to notice that the seam guide doesn't move because of that So Tacky technology, and the fabric stays right where it's supposed to. I really like this. A perfect 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, now to remove the ideal seam guide, that's what those little beveled edges are for. You just put your finger underneath the beveled edge and pull it up. And don't forget to put that little plastic acetate back on top of the So Tacky technology.
So why the curve and the notch? Well, let's find out.
So the curve was really designed to help you do curved seams, kind of like the drunkard's path, and that's what we're going to do today. You're going to find the seam allowance you want to use on your gauge, and in this case we are going to use the scant 1/4 inch. You're going to align the arrow on that curve with the scant 1/4 inch mark. And just follow the same steps you did earlier with sinking the needle into the hole that correlates with the seam allowance you want, which in this case is the scant 1/4 inch. Align the seam gauge, and then you're going to remove the acetate from the wrong side, just like you did before. But this time, you're going to find that curve and that arrow, and you're going to perfectly align the arrow with the scant 1/4 inch mark. Push it firm, and just follow the same steps by removing your gauge. And this is going to help you sew an outside curve to an inside curve, again, such as the drunkard's path. Next thing you're going to do is go ahead and act as if you were sewing the seam, but you're not going to have to worry about it. You're not going to have to think about, oh, I need to pin this and I need to make sure it's going to work. As long as you have the edge of your 2 pieces of fabric along the edge of that ideal seam guide that has the curve, it is going to be perfect. It's so cool. Now, I did use my by Annie stiletto and pressing tool to help me just keep my fingers out of the way, and this just helps me. It's kind of like an extra finger inside there and makes it really smooth for stitching. And you can use any stiletto for this. And you'll notice that every time this ideal seam guide allows you to get the perfect seam allowance. Check it out, it looks good, yay! Okay, so now why is there a notch in there? Well, the notch is really for your walking foot, so that you can do, let's say maybe like quilt as you go projects where you need the batting inside and the fabric. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and just find my regular 1/4 inch seam allowance, but again, you can use any one, and do the same steps where you're going to remove that acetate. And there's the tackiness, and you're going to place the ideal seam guide so that the presser foot can lower, but you still have the guide giving you the right seam allowance. And keep in mind that from machine to machine, brand to brand, your walking foot is going to be different widths, and there's going to be pieces in different places. So you're going to want to test this out before you start stitching a bunch. And there you go, works great. The next thing I'm going to show you, I think, is what I'm most excited about. It is top stitching. So you're going to find the 1/8 inch on your seam gauge and go ahead and sink your needle into the hole, align your presser foot with the seam gauge, remove the plastic off the guide, and place it firmly onto the bed of your machine. And remove the seam gauge. And now when you're sewing top stitching on something, oh, this is so wonderful. You're just gonna love it because you don't have to think. You don't have to keep your eye on anything except for the edge of that guide. Look at that, a perfect 1/8 inch top stitch. Another thing that you can do with this trio is you can do perfect seams on both sides. So let's say that you're doing like purse straps, or you're sewing a bunch of strips. You can adjust just like you've done before. You pick your seam allowance, and you're going to put one of the guides, long straight edge, on the right hand side, just like you have already up to this point. But in this demonstration, we're going to be using both of the ideal seam guides, one on each side of the fabric. So I've already removed my acetate, and I'm just going to place it on the left side of the fabric, and now I have a perfect distance in the middle. And this way your stitching will be perfectly straight on both sides. Again, I kind of keep thinking of purse straps where you could do the top stitching on both sides using this technique, or lots of strip piecing.
So one of my first questions was, how long will the sticky last? Well, the answer was 3,000 to 4,000 times. And truthfully, I don't personally get a chance to sew that much. So probably the answer is forever, but if it does get really linty and the gumminess doesn't stick as well, there is a very easy solution in cleaning it. All you're going to use is a little multi-purpose cleaner, scrub it a little bit, get rid of the lint, and then wash it off with warm water. And where can you get your very own set? Well, you can ask your local quilt shop because these are sold all around the world in quilt shops and sewing machine stores. And then you can also go to their website. And then if you really need to, you can go online. I've included a few links in the description below. And how much does it cost? Well, it depends on which one you're getting. I personally got the student edition pack, which retails for $25, but just check with your local dealer or go to their website and find out the prices. Well, if you enjoyed this video and learned something new, be sure to give me a thumbs up and don't forget to subscribe to this channel. That way you don't miss another video. And if you like behind the scenes kind of things, check me out on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook. Are there any sewing notions that you would like to see how to use them? Well, do me a favor and leave them in the comments below, or you can even tag me on Instagram or Facebook and I will surely find them. And until I see you next time, I hope you have a creative day. Bye-bye!
If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe below. And don't forget, you can also follow me on Instagram, Pinterest, and Facebook. Have a creative day. Bye-bye!